plane's gonna crash.
Oh, come on, Billy boy.
25 minutes, the whole thing cracks up.
You can't get out of your seat.
Stop the plane,
No,
please. Stop the plane.
sir.
It's gonna crash.
Back in your seat.
I've organized this charter. I'm
You wanna be
responsible.
removed from this
but you
plane?
don't understand.
Look, we've got our clearance. We're going to take off now, and everything's going to be all right. Now just buckle in and leave the driving to us. Lousy drunk son of a bitch. God, I hate these charter flights.
Hello, and welcome to World War II Movie Nights, the podcast where we examine the world's greatest conflict through the medium of film. I am your host, Jeff Byron, coming to you from the moonlit foothills of the Rocky Mountains, just between the world's largest brewery and the defunct nuclear weapons plant. A word of warning that because of World War II Movie Nights format, there will be spoilers aplenty, including but not limited to how the war ended. As an aside, if you'd like to contact us, just email worldwar2movienight@gmail.com. Every word spelled out. A 5-star rating is also appreciated. Oh, and before we delve into tonight's movie, just to reiterate, you can drop us a line for anything. We've done some listener requests, and we'll be doing more in the future, but you can contact us for any reason. For instance, we recently heard from David in Augusta, Georgia. He didn't so much make a request as he opined on several World War II movies in general, and had some kind words for the podcast. Most notably, though, he made his thoughts known on The Thin Red Line, which he wrote is one of the most boring war movies he's ever seen. And while I don't agree with that, I can kind of see where he's coming from. That one is a slow burn. But David added that he laughed when Woody Harrelson accidentally shot himself. He thought John Travolta looked like Freddie Mercury, and he thought Sean Penn had too much hair. So, a hand for David for keeping it real. I'm also hoping to get a Twitter presence going, so listeners have a forum to hold forth on the movies and episodes. On to tonight's movie. Well, this episode has been gestating for a long time, somewhat ironically. We're doing Slaughterhouse-Five, a 1972 American adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's famous 1969 novel. And the novel it remains famous and relevant today, which I'll get to in a minute with a couple examples. Although I wanted to eventually do this movie for World War II Movie Nights, I was prompted to get to it thanks to a fairly recent book on the Dresden bombings called The Fire and the Darkness. I read that, and it's excellent. It's one of the better World War II books I've read. It's just the right length. It tells an interesting story well, and it's interesting in that the Allied firebombing of Dresden, Germany is to this day considered controversial, as in, was it justified or did the Allies go too far? My 2 cents after reading the book was that you might view the actions as the Allies going too far only if you look at the action in a vacuum as an isolated thing. But when you consider the totality of the circumstances, the context of the war and everything that had come before, and how what was still to come was unknown, when you look at it that way, I think it was justified. Yeah, highly recommended The Fire and the Darkness, which obviously goes further into those concepts. And if you know anything about Slaughterhouse-Five, you know it's a semi-autobiographical work about Kurt Vonnegut's time as a prisoner of war in Dresden, including the bombing. From The Fire and the Darkness, quote, Vonnegut's extraordinary Slaughterhouse-Five was coalescing in his thoughts at that point. The novel in which fictional Billy Pilgrim in 1960s America finds himself jumping time tracks back and forth across his life. These tracks led ineluctably back to February 13th, 1945. Pilgrim was a fictional character, but Vonnegut deliberately placed him at the center of his own experiences of the bombing and the apocalyptic aftermath. Those parts of the novel were intended to be read as the literal truth. It was this work that not only cemented Vonnegut as a darkly comic and compelling literary voice, but also re-galvanized the furious ethical debates about what had been done to the city. Unquote. And that's from page 310 of the hardback version. And that brings us to the novel Slaughterhouse-Five. I read it in college some 25 years ago when I was going through a Kurt Vonnegut phase. Although Cat's Cradle is my favorite of his, Slaughterhouse-Five is a close second. Incidentally, Vonnegut was a great introduction to ambitious literature. His stuff is intelligent, yet easy to read. But that's not to say I liked his books across the board. I didn't get Breakfast of Champions, and didn't want to, and Jailbird was merely okay. Coincidentally, he came out with a new novel at this time that I was gifted, Timequake, and it was terrible. Not to be mean, but it was his last novel before his death 10 years later, and that's pretty typical of careers in many fields, especially creative ones. You get early successes, then peaks and valleys, and when the ride finally ends, you've been coasting on your name for a while. Some may disagree, but I think everyone would agree that Slaughterhouse-Five was his high-water mark. Especially rereading it all these years later, I realized that, contrary to first blush, it's not a chaotic mishmash, but actually a disciplined story with consistent themes, grappling with mortality, free will versus determinism. And I'm going to get into my interpretation, which is that the whole science fiction plot of the story is a metaphor for, again, what we today call PTSD. It's also well known that Slaughterhouse-Five is an anti-war book, and while that's not unique, the fact that the author experienced what he's describing lends the book a lot of gravitas in its anti-war messaging. Think of the fourth wall breaking thing when his friend's wife confronts the real-life Kurt Vonnegut about how he'll end up writing a book that glamorizes war and has a part for John Wayne in the movie. And, of course, you've got the protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, an anti-hero if ever there was one. He's a totally inadequate soldier, and two of the ones who are adequate are despicable psychopaths. Then you've got when the American POWs join up with the English POWs, all that stuff. It's like Slaughterhouse-Five just takes any sense of heroism or patriotism about the war and just obliterates it. But again, the messaging, it has more gravitas because Kurt Vonnegut was really there. And going back to what I was saying about it still being relevant today, in the early days of the pandemic lockdown, I heard someone quote a passage from Slaughterhouse-Five that he rightly felt was apropos to those early days of COVID. Quote, "The Englishman, when captured, had made and kept the following vows to himself: to brush his teeth twice a day, to shave once a day, to wash his face and hands before every meal and after going to the latrine, to polish his shoes once a day, to exercise for at least half an hour each morning, and then move his bowels, and to look into a mirror frequently, frankly evaluating his appearance, particularly with respect to posture." Unquote. Here's yet another sign of relevance. While I was rereading Slaughterhouse-Five, a much-touted graphic novel adaptation was released. After the novel, I read the comic, and it was really good. Like, it really captured the spirit of the novel, and say what you will about literature being redone as essentially comic books, but in this case it worked. That medium was really suited to telling Vonnegut's disjointed story. Oh, and check out this quote from Vonnegut in the graphic novel about the firebombings. "The Dresden atrocity, tremendously expensive and meticulously planned, was so meaningless, finally, that only one person on the entire planet got any benefit from it. I am that person. I wrote this book, which earned a lot of money for me and made my reputation such as it is. One way or another, I got $2 or $3 for every person killed. Some business I'm in." Great quote. And yeah, that sounds like Kurt Vonnegut. So, 3 books, 3 quotes. And like I said, this has been a long gestating episode. But the ironic part is that for as famous as the novel is, the movie version is strikingly non-famous and kind of unknown. At this point, you can go online and get information about the movie, but for years I could barely verify this movie existed, much less find it anywhere. Especially while reading that graphic novel, I saw chatter questioning whether Slaughterhouse-5 is even adaptable to film. And I thought, well, it was adapted to film, so the fact that question persists doesn't reflect well on the movie. And I unconsciously compare this to Catch-22. Both were unconventional World War II novels from the 60s embraced by the counterculture. Catch-22 was made into a Hollywood movie 2 years before Slaughterhouse-5, but even if people didn't like it, they tend to remember the Catch-22 movie. So, why not the Slaughterhouse-5 movie? Well, tonight we figure it out. And some really quick background. Slaughterhouse-5 was made by Universal Pictures. It was directed by George Roy Hill, who made this between two very successful movies, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid right before, and The Sting right after. Oh, and he made Slapshot. I have a friend who would like that. But Slaughterhouse-5 won some awards no one cares about. Oh, and Kurt Vonnegut had nothing to do with this movie, but he did say positive things about it. Quote, "I love George Roy Hill and Universal Pictures, who made a flawless translation of my novel Slaughterhouse-5 to the silver screen. I drool and cackle every time I watch that film because it is so harmonious with what I felt when I wrote the book." Unquote. That's one of those cases where it's so gushing you wonder if it's sarcasm. Like he throws in that he loves Universal Pictures. I don't know. From what I remember reading Vonnegut, that might have been meant tongue-in-cheek. Maybe I'm wrong. But it's time to get into it. And I'm going to proceed a little differently tonight. I'm going to start with the rating. It makes sense in this case. So, the 1972 American movie Slaughterhouse-5 gets a 2 out of 5 on World War II movie night. Yes, this movie is a mess. It's jumbled, it's full of strange choices by the filmmakers, and it may be the worst movie I've ever seen by the standard of if you haven't read the source material, you won't understand the movie. Because of that, I'll probably end up explaining the movie as much as going through it. Maybe I'm being unduly harsh because I did all that reading in preparation for watching Slaughterhouse-5. It's like, after all those books and fancy quotes and to build up to this movie, I kind of feel like a sucker. That makes me want to give it 1 out of 5, but I try to reserve that rating for outright ripoffs. No, 2 out of 5 is fair because I think in a way the filmmakers were tasked with achieving something unachievable, making Slaughterhouse-5 into a movie. So in that sense, it's not their fault. But yeah, because of all that, we're just going to have some fun tonight. No more pretension. We're going to go through Slaughterhouse-5 not seriously, and maybe my rating will make more sense. That said, let's get into it. Now, this opening scene is typical of much of the movie, where shows a scene, but unless you've read the novel, you won't know what it means. Billy Pilgrim is an older man, a widower at this point, and has been writing letters to the paper about how he travels through time involuntarily. So the first scene is his adult daughter and her husband trying to get into his house as he clacks away another letter. "I have come unstuck in time," he types, and that's basically the opening line of the novel. To show this concept, Billy jumps from this scene back to being a young man in World War II. He's in a snowy forest and avoiding a German convoy. And this is the main image of the movie, it seems, a miserable Billy Pilgrim walking in the snow. This is also the first example of the film's odd music choice, which is very sparse classical music, lots of subtle piano. We get the opening credits. But afterward, we see that we're behind German lines and Billy is apprehended by 2 Allied soldiers. I say apprehended because he's not wearing a conventional uniform, so they think he's a German spy. But once it's established that Billy is an American, a chaplain's assistant, we see the dynamics between the American soldiers, and they're not good. One guy says he's going into the snowstorm to find a farmhouse, and the other 2 soldiers realize he's ditched them. A short guy named Paul Lazzaro, who will figure heavily into the story, talks about how he'll track the corporal down after the war and show up at his door one day and shoot him. And yes, supposedly Kurt Vonnegut knew a guy in the war who was always threatening to do that to people he didn't like, track them down and kill them in the future. But Billy's lying down and he starts fantasizing about a beautiful woman. This will make more sense later. And he's saying the flirty stuff out loud back in the war, so the Paul Lazzaro character is enraged and beats him as he yells, "You effing fairy! You effing F-word!" Oh, I guess all of those are F-words. This creates what I thought was a humorous scene where the other soldier intervenes to see why Paul's beating up Billy, and then the other soldier beats up Paul. And as this cluster, F-word, is happening, they look up and see many German soldiers are standing mere feet away, guns drawn, looking baffled at what they're seeing. Nonetheless, they take the 3 men prisoner. So this establishes the base plot, I'd say, but before going on, I have to explain that because of its structure, the pacing of this movie is odd. And it may sound odd to describe it, but next scene is Billy and his wife have just consummated their wedding night. The wife is very happy and says she knows Billy saw bad things in the war, but that it's over now. Oh, incidentally, there's a streak throughout the novel, and it's kind of continued in the movie, of making fun of the wife for being fat. And I don't subscribe to the current way of thinking that, especially in comedy, it's just totally off limits to make fun of someone's weight. Like, I can laugh at those jokes, but here it still comes off as a little mean. And the thing is, again, how much times change, is his really overweight wife in this movie is not much overweight by today's standards. Like now, depending on where she was in America, she really wouldn't stick out much. But back in the war, we get Billy and a line of prisoners being led through the streets of some German town, almost as a procession. And people have gathered to watch him and the others. Kids look at them, harlequins gawk from the windows of their brothels, etc. And for some reason, he's singled out and photographed for propaganda purposes. Then we see him at home after the war, and knowing this from reading the novel, he becomes an optometrist and very respected businessman in his community, always getting awards and whatnot. But we see him being photographed for like a ribbon cutting years later in America, and this really backs up my theory that the time jumping is a metaphor for being traumatized by the war. Because he seems like the time jumping is essentially flashbacks. Like he's getting his picture taken, opening his new optometry practice, and he flashes back to having his picture taken as a prisoner of war. And usually these scenes are shown with people in his post-war life asking, "Billy, are you okay?" Of course, there's one scene around this time that shows that even more, where it's shortly after he's come back from the war, and Billy's had a nervous breakdown, and he's in a hospital bed hiding under the covers, watching his mother talk to the guy in the other bed. But she sees him peeking out from under the covers, again, a full-grown man, and she says, Billy, sweetheart, the war is over. You can come out now." But then we're back in the war, and Billy and all of them are cramped into a rail car. And we get one of the biggest subplots in the movie. Paul Lazzaro starts to repeatedly threaten Billy that he's going to kill him. He's a dick nonetheless, but this is specifically because a guy in the rail car dies and he claims Billy killed him. When they were being marched through the streets, Billy kept inadvertently bumping into him, and it looked like he had gangrenous feet. And the whole chain of events is different in the book, but incidentally, this actor is the one who dies as Kevin Conway, who did die somewhat recently, but he was in stuff here and there, and I remember him especially from a very effective slasher movie in the early 80s, The Funhouse, where he had multiple roles. This guy claims it was Billy who killed him, and as he dies, Paul Lazzaro comforts him and says he'll get revenge on Billy, and he says the sweetest thing in life is revenge. And he tells a horrible story about killing a dog. Quick cut to his post-war life. Billy's getting electroshock therapy. The doctor talks about how the war had an effect on his condition. We also get a formative memory that traumatized Billy of his father throwing him into a pool to teach him how to swim. So, yeah, there's this cumulative effect that people have been mean to Billy his whole life, and even when people aren't mean to him, he often fails to connect with them anyway. Again, by modern standards, people would wonder if young Billy was on the spectrum. Back in the war, the rail car arrives at their prison camp. Dead bodies are stacked unceremoniously. The English prisoners greet them with a big party, and it's kind of sad because they walk past the Russian prisoners who look really dejected and jealous. We then get a scene of an English prisoner telling Billy his routine, and this is basically the quote I said earlier, and although in the book it seems like it's meant to be inspirational, here it's played for humor, or at least another instance of people talking to Billy and him not getting it. One person he does connect with, though, is Edgar Derby, who's a teacher back home, and he's so anti-Hitler he said he had to join up. He's also older than the others to the point where he has a son serving in the Pacific Theater. But he and Billy really form a friendship, and Edgar, among other things, shoos away Paul Lazzaro as he continues to threaten Billy. Paul Lazzaro's, apart from being a psycho, he's obnoxious to an almost inhuman level. I'm trying to figure out if he's even more obnoxious than the Cletus-looking guy in Fury. Then the men find out they're being moved to Dresden. They're told it's an open city and of no military significance, so while they'll be doing hard labor as prisoners, they'll at least have some degree of safety. So there's a sequence of them arriving in Dresden. That classical music plays over. Scenes of the city's architecture in the winter sun, fancy spires and all that. And there's another scene of the crowd watching as they're marched through the street, although it seems less threatening than before. Our guys find out where they'll be held, in a row of abandoned slaughterhouses. And just as with Kurt Vonnegut in real life, they'll be staying in the fifth one, or Slaughterhouse 5. Back in the States, in Billy's post-war life, he and his father-in-law are flying to an optometrist convention. And this is odd, but their families are gathered outside a hangar, seeing them off like they're embarking on an epic journey. There's even a banner, but everyone's happy, and this shows how, again, Billy's post-war life is pretty successful. On the plane, Billy's father-in-law even says how when he first met him, he thought he was a loser, but he doesn't think that anymore. We get a development that's really one of the biggest in the movie. Billy looks out the window at the waving families, and he also sees some men standing in these weird masks. It's an authentically creepy image, actually. Then Billy realizes the plane's going to crash. He says in 25 minutes it's going to crack up. His father-in-law's like, ha ha. Billy even tries to tell the pilots, but that doesn't go well. So later they're in the air, and as like a barbershop quartet is singing, the plane cracks up, and no, again, don't expect special effects, they just do some weird camera stuff. But then Billy's laying in snow and with a bloodied face, and a ski patrol of rescue workers come, and their face masks are such we realize that's what Billy saw earlier. Yeah, this whole sequence isn't bad. This does lead to one of the weirder choices in the movie. In the book, while Billy is in the hospital, on the way there, his wife has a fender bender, and it ultimately causes her to die from carbon monoxide. Now, in the movie, this is a long sequence that's kind of played for laughs. Like, it's almost wacky, and her hysteria is shown as funny.
God's sakes, lady, why'd you jam on your brakes? Look what you've done!
Billy fell out of a plane. He's falling out of a plane.
All right.
I was on my way to the hospital and I missed my
drag you there.
entrance. No, it's in Vermont, stupid. Billy.
Hey, let me see your license! You can't leave the scene of an accident, lady! Your exhaust is shut to hell! Damn it, lady, you're going the wrong way!
But she starts going the wrong way on the highway, takes the off-ramp instead of the on-ramp, and This made me take note because where I am, for some reason, our highway department just recently, plastered the highway off-ramps with wrong way and do not enter signs. I don't know what precipitated this, like if the governor's mother got into an accident doing that, but yeah, the off-ramp closest to my house is about the length of a football field, and it's got 6 of those signs. It's like visual overkill. But back to Mrs. Pilgrim's wild ride. It's demolition derby, like she's sideswiping cars, and this was the era of those boats, keep in mind. Later they say this is a Cadillac. She runs a motorcycle gang off the road and then almost T-bones a semi, and she drives down and up a huge embankment, and then the guy she had the accident with, he's explaining it to another guy, and they see her coming back, and both of them take off running like, here she comes again! And yeah, like I said, this is such an odd sequence. It's action mixed with humor, and I'm sure in the theater audiences were laughing at this part. Then it ends after a flashback to their anniversary where he gifted her the Cadillac that she's now died in. Then Billy's operated on as it's intercut with scenes from Slaughterhouse-5. So next, Billy's recovering in the hospital, and they go into this more in the book, but his roommate is some hotshot guy recovering from a broken leg, and he has a much younger wife who's brought him some stuff for a history book he's writing about Dresden. She asked him why they kept Dresden secret for so long. Oh, hell, for fear a lot of bleeding hearts would say bombing it was a chicken shit thing to do. My book's gonna lay it on the line, sweetheart. No one's gonna weep and wail over Dresden after they read my book. Billy says, I was there, but they ignore him. As he's thinking back to his time in Dresden, the other guy continues and lies out the other side of the arguments, maybe somewhat belligerently, which we alluded to earlier with the Allied bombing of Dresden being controversial. We didn't start the war, the Nazis did, and 135,000 people dying in Dresden does not seem like so very much when put against over 5 million allies who had to die. And you just might remember that when we were bombing Dresden, the Germans were sending V-1 and V-2 rockets into London, killing men, women, and children. Jesus, it gives me a pain, weeping over Dresden and not give a damn about our own losses. What about Coventry? What about Rotterdam? What about the extermination camps the Germans were running? Gassings? Maimings? Then Billy's back in Dresden, and we get an ominous crawler. February 13th, 1945. Later, it's almost 10 p.m., and Billy and the others are eating when they get a visitor. Now, this is Howard Campbell Jr., an American propagandist for the Nazis. And although people like him existed, this is a fictional creation by Kurt Vonnegut, who even got his own novel, Mother Nights, which I always thought was written after Slaughterhouse-5, but it was before. So this is his second appearance in the Vonnegut universe. He dresses in quite the outfit, a helmet and a powder blue suit that has parts of both the American and Nazi flags. And I'm going to go ahead and play this. Paul Lazzaro challenges him and then ends up volunteering. And the third voice is Edgar Derby, who also heckles Campbell.
Attention, please. You're having a visitor. Howard Campbell Jr.
I've just come back from the Russian front, so I'll make it short. I don't want to take up your time. I know how hungry you are. Food's not much, though, is it?
Food's terrific. Almost as neat as your outfit.
Then I have a proposition for you. How would you like to come back to America with me after this war as heroes?
It's great, as long as I can wear that fag outfit.
Since you're so interested in my outfit, I'll tell you what it's about. Blue is for the American sky. White is for the race that pioneered that continent, cleared the forests, drained the swamps, built the roads and the bridges. And the red is for the blood of fine American boys that's been shed in defense of your freedom.
I don't see you shedding any blood, Campbell.
You all know that communism is out to enslave the world. And who's out there trying to stop them? The Germans. They're not your enemies. They're your allies. Communism is the enemy of all of us. Now, I want volunteers for the Free American Corps. Men who are willing to stand up to these commies.
Sit down, Lazaro.
I didn't vote for you, Derby.
Good. Now, who's next? I'll tell you, men, if we don't stop them now, they're gonna...
Everybody moves to the air shelter.
There be no bombs. Churchill's nebula's right in the heart of it.
And it's kind of funny when Campbell mentions the white race stuff. Paul Lazaro sort of perks up like, maybe I could get into this. But yes, there's an air raid, and they're all hustled into a shelter. Edgar Derby continues disagreeing with Campbell, who shoots back, "History will prove you an ass." And soon it's clear that no, this really is a bombing. We see the shelter shake, the men look scared, and we get some grainy stock footage of nighttime bombings. Obviously, we weren't going to get special effects portraying the bombing, and reading about the Dresden bombing, it's interesting to learn exactly what happens during a firebombing, how it works. You can see why they kill so many people. It would be interesting to see a firebombing like this portrayed with modern special effects and a big budget, but it would be so gruesome, I don't think they'd do it. The next day, though, we get the aftermath when everyone emerges from the shelter to look at the city. And this does look pretty good. It looks like they spent some money on this set. The formerly beautiful Dresden is a bombed-out husk. Fires are still going, ruins are smoldering, etc. And I'm just going to wrap up this plotline now. Our men, the prisoners, have to clean up. We see a pyre of dead bodies lit on fire as they look on, even Paul Lazaro. And later, Edgar Derby is shot for a very innocent act of what the Nazis perceive as looting. This moves us into the final act of the movie, really the last 15 minutes or so. Billy Pilgrim has been released from the hospital after his traumatic brain injury and the death of his wife. His adult daughter doesn't want him staying alone, but he has his loyal dog. One night, his son comes to see him. Earlier, as a teenager, his son was wayward, like they show where he vandalized a cemetery. But now he's a military officer home from Vietnam, and he's a proud young man and respectable toward his father. He's also proud of his military service. Everybody knows it's a lousy war, but sooner or later it's going to be us or the communists. We got to stand up to them somewhere. So now we get into the plot line that they save for almost the last minutes of the movie. And I'm going to go through it rather quickly. Billy is taken by aliens to planet Tralfamador. There he's basically a zoo display, although he lives in relative comfort. He speaks with a disembodied voice and tells him all the aliens live in the fourth dimension, so he can't see them. The voice also explains that they live in a time structure in which everything happens at once. Billy adapts this outlook, which is why throughout his life he's been able to see the past and the future, including his own death. But in the last 10 minutes of the movie, we're introduced to a main character that we haven't met, but we've seen teased throughout the movie. And teased is the right word. Think of the scene in the woods of him dreaming of some beautiful woman. Later, we also had Billy walking on his teenage son masturbating, and Billy took the magazine and looking at the centerfold, smiled knowingly. During another scene, Billy and his family, his wife and two teenagers, are at a drive-in and they're watching a movie where a woman shows her breasts. His wife is apoplectic, but Billy again smiles knowingly. So now it comes full circle. Billy and his dog aren't the only captives. The aliens also zap in Montana Wildhack, who's a risque starlet back on Earth, and they've chosen her to mate with Billy. But she's zapped in, only wearing a bikini bottom, so she's topless. Oh, and yeah, there's a lot of nudity in this movie, which was surprising, and I'm sure teenage boys who saw this when it came out found that quite the bonus. Like, I wasn't expecting this. Although Montana Wildhack initially attacks Billy, she finds out he's the right sign or something, so she trusts him. And I think that's accurate. Weren't women during this time really into astrology? But Montana, who says she was snatched away from Earth when she was topless sunbathing at a producer's pool, she's taken by what a gentleman Billy is. She even says, "You don't meet many gentlemen in the entertainment business." That's kind of funny, but it made me think of, like, tropes. In romance novels, there's a common trope about like a prince or something stopping into a supermarket and meeting a regular gal who he's taken with. Like, he doesn't want to be with his princesses or heiresses anymore, he wants to be with her. Well, as fantastical as that scenario is, there is a gender-swapped version of that, which is of a starlet type who encounters a regular guy, and she's charmed by his schlubbiness. You know, suddenly she doesn't want the rich, handsome guys who usually pursue her, she wants him. Well, that's kind of where this goes, and there is a pretty funny thing about how the booming voice that talks to them keeps asking if they're going to mate. And again, this sequence brings up so many thoughts, like because of the design, how they're in this transparent dome that looks out at the night sky with all the weird planets. It's like a space set from the Muppets or something, but with a weird pornography vibe thrown in. Finally, something else I thought from this scene was, I didn't find the woman all that attractive. And I think it's because of how much these things change from era to era. Like, this woman is supposed to be a wet dream incarnate. And while, yes, she's attractive and has a good body, her look just doesn't scream that to me. Like, that's the thing. The physical attributes of a hot woman may not change, but the looks change from era to era. You know, just kind of what look is in or out. This is, if you want to see that proven also from, with men, just go back and look at a picture of all people, John Wilkes Booth, and remember that he was considered a devastatingly handsome actor. And, you know, see if you can see that, like, in looking at his pictures. So, again, that shows how different eras, what's considered attractive changes. Then we're back on Earth, and Billy openly talks about how he secretly lives on this other planet with this sexy starlet. But then we get his death, which he knows is coming. He's given a speech to a big crowd about life on Tralfamadore and how time jumping works, and he says that he'll be assassinated during his speech. Everyone's shocked, and later, well, who should step from behind a pillar but an old man, Paul Lazzaro. He shoots Billy dead. As the crowd panics, he screams, "Nobody F's with Paul Lazzaro!" Back on Tralfamadore, Montana has given birth to a baby boy. The unseen aliens applaud Billy and Montana and their new baby as fireworks go off in the night sky. The end. Yeah, as I said, the pacing of this movie is odd. Reactions. Well, this might be redundant since I addressed this earlier, but I don't know. What did you think? I gave this a 2 out of 5, and I stand by that. If this movie had only been about the World War II stuff, it would have made a 3, but it's not just the World War II stuff. And maybe that's unfair because this movie has to hew to its source material, this very famous novel. That novel is brilliant, and in a very surface way, that brilliance occasionally makes it into the movie. I guess what I'm saying is whoever made this movie really got the novel Slaughterhouse-5 for what that's worth. Like, this movie is a good representation of the novel and the interesting things it has to say about war as much as it can be. So that's good, but again, ignoring the source material and just taking this as a standalone movie, it's not good. I smile thinking about, like, teenagers going to see this movie when it came out, and maybe they didn't care and just wanted a place to smoke pot and make out, but either way, they would have been like, what the hell is this movie about? And with the adaptation angle, that's another thing. A sign that this novel shouldn't have been adapted to film is that it's been nearly half a century and no one's tried to adopt this to film again. It's like, especially in this time where everything's being remade and rebooted and re-whatever, no one has talked about Slaughterhouse-5. I mean, even Catch-22 was made into a series a year ago, and it was quite good, by the way. Anyway, seek out that graphic novel adaptation. That's worth your time. So yeah, after all that preparation with the books and research, the actual movie of this episode just sputtered out. Go figure. Oh, and I found this funny. I purchased this movie on YouTube, and on the side where they show all the suggestions based on their algorithms, all of my suggestions were for time travel movies, and quite the variety of them. They even had Time Cop on there. But ironically, one of the suggestions was the Philadelphia Experiment, which you'll recall was an earlier episode of World War II Movie Night, and fittingly also got a 2 out of 5. So yeah, I think the conclusion here is that World War II and time travel don't mix. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. For our next episode, I wanted to do something more modern, but also a straightforward World War II movie. So we're going to look at Hacksaw Ridge from 2016. I have not seen this movie. I've heard it's harsh, though. And this is also made by Mel Gibson, so that's interesting right there. But yeah, we'll meet back here next time to talk about it. Until then, good night.